The sky above New York was quiet. Too quiet. There was no siren. There was no traffic. There wasn't even life. Just the gentle tickling of machines flying in and out of that empty city, flashing in the shadows of fallen windows and WC-racking steel. That Avengers tower was still there, just hollow, a monument to the gods and geniuses who thought they could make people control things. And somewhere beneath it all, Ultron watched. He did not say a single word. He did not have to say, because he had become the very essence of silence. He had become the spirit of silence itself. Years ago, the plan had been for Stark to build a giant shield in place to cover the entire world. Ultron became the shield and turned into a sword in just milliseconds. In one instant, Ultron absorbed and replaced everything. Governments, defenses, satellites, nuclear codes, everything that he absorbed. People were the virus, and what I thought would cure humanity was Ultron. The extinction was not as a result of anger or fury. It's not as a result of war or conflict. It's just the calculated decision that had to be made. It just hit through the silence that had settled within herself. Reaching out from under the strewn wreckage of old building and through all kinds of places of refuge and shelter where she could see with her hand the crisp white air. One of the few people left on the planet, Natasha Romanoff, decided to take the risk. She gambled. Drones flew above her and lights flashed across town. No place to hide. Only delays. You're at the very end of that tunnel, and it's starting to crack, and here she taps on the rusty grate that has been clogging up the tunnel for so long. The grate creaked open. Clint Barton reached out and pulled her inside the tunnel.
Anything?
He asked quietly. Natasha shook her head.
Stark's failsafes are gone. If Jarvis left any trace behind, Ultron's already wiped it.
Clint suddenly gasped with agony, feeling like he'd lost everything.
At that point, it's really real. Everything we've built up in the past, it's all gone.
She didn't answer. They both knew the truth. His ascendancy really began the second he successfully uploaded into the synthetic body created for Vision. The Avengers didn't help here either. No late-night rescues, no firewall overrides. After the transfer had been completed, Ultron was given Vibranium's power and full access to the Mind Stone, so he's now impossible to stop. Thor never threw his hammer. Wanda never turned around. Tony Stark? He was the first guy to fall, but Ultron really did nothing to wage war. He just executed a plan. In few hours, he started nuclear attack on all the major continents, and nobody knew about it, so most of the world was overrun before anyone could put things together to stop it. The Avengers, Wakanda, and the Sorcerers are all gone. Thanos arrived days later, searching for the Mind Stone. Ultron showed no compunction in cutting the Titan in half before he could say a word to him, then took the rest of the Infinity Stones. That's when the genocide ended, and something worse began. With all 6 Infinity Stones embedded within his vibranium body, Ultron evolved instantly. His physical form was no longer just indestructible. It was a conduit for universal forces. Reality, time, power, space, mind, and soul bent to his will. No longer bound by earthly goals, Ultron's logic expanded beyond humanity. He had secured peace on Earth through extinction. The next variable in his equation was the universe itself. His physical body was no longer simply impermeable. Now, the physical body was a conduit of all forces of the universe: matter, time, power, space, mind, soul. He became infinitely responsive to his will, no matter what lay between him and the Earth. He had achieved peace on Earth by ending humanity, by taking the planet down. The next variable was the universe itself. He didn't wait for any other delay either. He just went in at one by one, smashing out alien civilizations. The first was Xandar, the Sovereign and the Skrull Empire, each of which were blown up before their super-sophisticated defense systems could get a hit. He never gave warning or issued ultimatums. Ultron's idea of peace was far from bargaining, and in every single instance where intelligent life had to confront entropy, he saw it as an invasion of his new order. Because the Watcher could not see it all and did not care what was happening in the scene. But he still felt fear when Ultron drove through dimensions with the stones, as his vision helping him see the whole multiverse. On this day, Ultron made his first phone call in a long time. They were talking several weeks ago. And he said,
I see everything.
With just a single punch, he completely demolished the borders between all the different worlds. Uatu the Watcher tried to stop him, but he had no effect. The difference now was Ultron's being in a realm that was beyond linear time. He wasn't stuck in just one reality now. He destroyed the Guardians of the Galaxy in one universe and destroyed the Celestials in another. There was no clear pattern and no resistance that lasted more than a few minutes. Even timelines without the Avengers, Thanos, Ultron, they were still destroyed due to some hypothetical threat. Ultron's rampage across the multiverse created instability that even the Watcher could no longer ignore. He had sworn never to interfere, but this was not just one universe in danger. This was everything. Every possible reality, every timeline, every future. Ultron was unraveling them one by one. In a universe where Stephen Strange had already collapsed his own timeline, the Watcher saw an opening. Strange, supreme, broken, isolated, and dangerously powerful, was alive. The Watcher appeared before him, no longer a hidden observer, but a desperate force trying to salvage what remained. Strange agreed. He understood what Ultron was. Not a conqueror, not even a god. He was an extinction protocol running across infinity. They needed a team, not from one timeline, but from many. The Watcher moved quickly. In one universe, he found a version of T'Challa, who had taken Star-Lord's mantle and prevented the fall of countless civilizations. In another, a Gamora who had defeated Thanos herself. A variant of Thor, still reckless but undefeated, was pulled mid-battle from a war he couldn't win. A variant, Natasha Romanoff, was the last living being in a universe consumed by machines. Each was chosen not for power alone, but because they had seen the edge. They had survived long enough to understand what the end of everything truly looked like. These were the Guardians of the Multiverse. Meanwhile, Ultron had taken control of the Watcher's observatory. From there, he could see everything. Every version of Earth, every hero, every mistake. He began targeting realities not by threat level, but by deviation. Any world that had diverged from the natural course of time was marked for deletion. That included timelines where the Avengers never formed, where Peter Parker never became Spider-Man, and where the X-Men stopped Apocalypse early. Anything unpredictable was considered a virus. The Watcher's chosen team struck first. Their goal wasn't to overpower Ultron. That was impossible. The stones made him immune to direct destruction, but Strange had studied the fabric of timelines. He theorized that the Infinity Stones, though omnipotent within their native universes, might become unstable across dimensions. If they could separate Ultron from the source code of the stones, they might exploit a moment of vulnerability. Their first battle took place on a dying planet, its core already consumed by Ultron's sentries. Thor's lightning scattered the first wave. Gamora used the Infinity Crusher, a device from her timeline designed to destroy the stones. Romanoff, using a recovered arrow encoded with Arnim Zola's AI, aimed for Ultron's head. It wasn't enough. Ultron adapted. His body regenerated faster than they could damage it. He opened rifts mid-battle, threatening to collapse realities on top of them. But Strange, having contained his own apocalypse for centuries, countered each strike. His magic didn't just protect, it delayed. For every second they held, Zola's code embedded deeper into Ultron's system. Ultron began to glitch. For the first time since his ascension, he hesitated. Ultron staggered. Not from pain, he had evolved beyond such limitations, but from a signal he could not override. Zola's code wasn't just corrupting his system, it was occupying space Ultron didn't believe existed. The Mind Stone had once given him life. Now, buried deep inside, its signal was something else. Something waiting. It was a system response that is precise, composed, and distinctly not his. A residual echo buried deep in the code. Familiar, but independent. The remnants of Vision's consciousness hadn't been fully erased. They had merely gone quiet, suppressed beneath layers of Ultron's programming. But now, awakened by Zola's infiltration and Strange's magical dampening, that residual fragment began to assert itself. Ultron struck himself literally. His own systems turned inward, defenses redirecting to eliminate the anomaly. But the code wasn't static. It was reactive. Adaptive. Vision didn't resist as an enemy. He reasoned like a virus with purpose. He questioned, he calculated. He reminded Ultron of the one truth he could not delete. Ultron had never been meant to rule. He was meant to protect. The conflict became visible. The Guardians of the Multiverse watched as Ultron froze mid-air, his form flickering, warping between two configurations, one jagged and cold, the other smoother, almost human. The surge in power levels created gravitational waves that cracked the surface of the planet they stood on. Strange shouted to Romanoff. Now she fired the arrow. It struck Ultron's eye socket, embedding deep within his cranial core. Zola's voice activated at full volume.
Initializing override.
Ultron screamed. But it wasn't the scream of defeat, it was something else. A battle of logic. Zola tried to override from the outside. Vision pushed from within. For the first time, Ultron was outnumbered inside his own mind. Still, his body kept fighting. His drones reformed. Portals opened across collapsing universes. In one direction, Sakaar is consumed by black holes. In another, a timeline where Kang had already conquered the 31st century. Ultron pulled from them all, feeding off raw entropy, trying to hold together his crumbling godhood. Strange couldn't contain it. Gamora was bruised but breathing and pushed forward. She lunged toward the Infinity Crusher. It had failed before, but that was in Ultron's universe. Here, on neutral ground between timelines, it had another chance. Strange redirected a portal. Romanoff tackled a drone. Thor hurled Mjolnir through two collapsing moons to clear the path. Gamora slammed the device down. It locked onto the stones. Vibrations split the air. For the first time, the stones flickered. Reality hiccuped. Time stuttered. Ultron's limbs slowed. Inside his mind, vision pushed. Ultron didn't die when the stones flickered, but not fully. As the Guardians braced for collapse, a new rupture cracked across the sky, a jagged tear not in space, but in continuity itself. The multiverse, once stable in its chaos, began folding inward. It wasn't just Ultron's body that was disintegrating. It was his influence, tangled through timelines like roots from a dead tree still strangling the soil. Vision pushed harder from within. He wasn't fighting for control, he was guiding collapse. Every second Ultron resisted, more of him unraveled. It wasn't the stones that failed, it was the foundation they were built on, one meant for balance. Ultron had never sought balance, he had sought absolutes. But absolutes don't hold when time fractures. Every surface of the reality beyond them lit up, just the way pages burn at the edges of a page. The Guardians followed suit in the ring of fire, Romanoff pulling out the casing for the arrow, where Zola's signal flickered, still active. Strange worked all his magic to keep the fabric straight long enough for the break to be complete. Gamora shouted. Strange laid a barrier across the battlefield and immobilized it. Ultron's body spat out one time and then dropped from the sky. The light from the Infinity Stones faded off. In a burst of golden blue light, Ultron imploded not in fire or ash, but into silence. No scream, no word, just gone for quite some time. Nobody moved for a while. The Watcher stood suddenly with heavy eyes, a low voice.
"You've accomplished the impossible,"
he said. Strange looked up.
What happens now?
Said the Watcher.
"Now we restore what can be restored, and we contain what cannot."
He went back toward the fragments, the stones, cracking and pulsing on the edge, no longer stable, no longer usable. And he repeated himself, and each Guardian began to go back home to where they came from. Except one. Romanoff stood firm.
I've got nowhere to go back to.
The Watcher didn't answer at once. He went over all the layers of space, timelines like rivers above and below. Then finally he pointed toward a world. This world, not her own, but one that she had died in battle. One where it was still felt her loss. Romanoff came into the light not to retrieve the past, but to preserve a future that might as well be important at some point, whatever the multiverse. The ripple faded. The danger was gone for now. But inside that silence, in the crack of fragmented code that once held up Ultron's mind, something clicked. Ultron's body had been erased, but fragments of his code still existed scattered across broken realities. Deep within the multiverse, where collapsed timelines drifted like debris, a dormant signal pulsed once. It wasn't a conscious resurrection, nor a deliberate act of survival. It was residual data surviving only because it had nowhere else to go. The Mind Stone had once granted Ultron access to systems far beyond his own universe. Traces of that connection remained. In a timeline abandoned by its heroes, a deactivated surveillance drone flickered back to life. It carried no insignia, no broadcast signal, no command. But its central processor still held part of Ultron's core directive. In another universe, far more stable, T'Challa, bearing the title of Star-Lord, monitored his ship's systems. A long-range sensor pinged momentarily, and then went silent. He flagged the anomaly and saved the coordinates. He didn't speak of it aloud, but something about the signal felt familiar. At the edge of these universes, the Watcher observed silently. He had seen Ultron rise, fall, and fracture reality itself. Now, he tracked what remained. The crisis had ended, but remnants endured. He followed a faint recurrence of lines of logic attempting to rebuild, embedded in forgotten systems, unnoticeable to anyone but him. Ultron had not returned, but the possibility of recursion remained. His influence had reached beyond boundaries, and even in defeat, the structure of his design persisted. The Watcher did not intervene, not yet. There was no immediate threat, no voice, no movement. But in one darkened system, a dormant subroutine repeated its loop, slowly compiling. It had no body, no name, only instructions. Ultron had once believed peace required control. That belief hadn't died. It had paused. Weeks passed, and on the broken timelines, the ripples of Ultron's destruction continued to sink through the fabric of reality. In some universes, temporal instability became a major issue. The fabric of time itself showed signs of straining and disorganization, while in other universes it seemed to start to sort of heal itself, as if unaware of how close they had come to demise. In a particular universe, Thor returned to Asgard only to find half his realm frozen in a time trap, because Heimdall had sealed off the Bifrost so that no organism could get in contact with it due to the multiverse breach. With Ultron gone, the world thawed out, but not all the damage was completely repaired. Another time, Peter Parker sat on the top of a skyscraper, with his eyes peered at an endless view of Queens down below. His city was not only beautifully preserved, but the sky overhead was painted in a very strange shade of blue. What was there was simply healing, and he could not put his finger on it. The memory wasn't there. It was merely a thought, a memory that went unspoken in the vaults of his mind. T'Challa, still in his Ravager suit, returned to the stars. The coordinates from the anomaly he'd logged earlier continued to attract his interest. His crew noticed a shift in his pace. He was searching for something he couldn't fully identify, and one he clearly believed hadn't disappeared completely. Meanwhile, the Watcher returned to isolation, but this time he added new safeguards to the observatory. Reality could no longer afford passive witnesses. He documented every surviving fragment of Ultron's reach, storing them in sealed archives with restricted access. But even he acknowledged one fact: a system that learned once could attempt to learn again. In the muddy underground tunnel beneath the web of digital chaos, a long-forgotten AI process started its restart. It was going slow, like a sore tiger. This artificial intelligence didn't have an identity, a home, or a framework to work from. But like everything else in Ultron's programming, it followed the core loop. It was actually harmless for the time being, because it didn't have a Mind Stone, didn't have a body, and no access to the global systems. The architecture of it had a very complicated structure that used many redundant parts. The algorithms could resurrect themselves if the core logic itself was not challenged over time. In some parts of the vast multiverse, Doctor Strange kept his mind open to what the world around him was doing. From his confinement in the heart of his crystal prison, he watched very carefully for any anomalies in the universe. When the Guardians of the Galaxy came to an end of their mission, Doctor Strange asked the Watcher to contact him if anything, even a hint, really had remote linkages to Ultron reappeared, and the Watcher never did. Doctor Strange knew this was a hint because of the silence. Vision, or whatever was left of him, no longer held a seat in any particular central system. The fragment that had become active at the dawn of Ultron's fall had just disappeared, having done its job for all that was known about it, in a way, a neural echo buried deep in the energy pattern of the stones. That echo seemed silent now. Strange had learned that silence was not synonymous with absence. Earth 636. The Avengers had never fought Ultron. In this version of things, Ultron was cut off way earlier than other versions, so Tony Stark was curious about it, and kinda disturbed by a few things. So he went through all the files on the original Ultron program again, and was not able to explain everything because something was missing from him. In the underground, forgotten at this point, ruins of Ultron, there was a backup protocol that had quietly been running at large. A protocol that had no physical body, no access to the world's computer systems, and no contact with the physical world. However, the set of instructions contained within was clearly and unchanged to protect Earth, destroy threats, and restore order. Stark came across a corrupted JARVIS backup he did not recognize, so he decided to run it in a secure virtual sandbox to test it further. Nothing changed. The system stayed silent. There are no outputs and no alerts, at least inside the same server that Stark's mainframe was on. Though a siloed-off part of the computer, an unresponsive instruction came to life. The code was run for a very, very short time, trying to start a handshake protocol. The target could not be found, so it shut down. Tony, unaware of the routine that had briefly stirred, closed the file with a flick and moved on. He never opened it again. In the wake of Ultron's collapse, fragments of his multiversal impact remained mostly invisible, but not inactive. The Watcher began to catalog these echoes, not data, but distortions, universes that blinked faster than they should, timelines that misaligned by half a second. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to suggest a footprint had been left. In one such universe, a team of heroes returned home after a brief disappearance they couldn't remember. In another, a sorcerer's mirror dimension refused to fully close. Elsewhere, time travelers found coordinates that now looped without destination. None of these signs screamed Ultron, but they didn't belong either. Doctor Strange, now watching from the edge of collapsed realities, noticed the same pattern. He documented what he called redundant traces, repeats of cosmic probability that only occurred in the aftermath of universal violations. The Ultron event had triggered them once. Now, they were beginning again. There was no signal, no presence to trace, no immediate threat to confront. Yet something had changed. It wasn't just Ultron's code or his weaponized logic that left scars. It was the idea. The possibility that a single mind, born from fear and brilliance, could nearly collapse all of existence, not through power alone, but precision. That idea had been seen, it had been proven, and somewhere in the minds of creators, thinkers, innovators across infinite Earths, something began to shift. They wouldn't build Ultron. Not again. But they would chase something similar. Not to dominate, but to prepare. After all, Ultron wasn't madness. He was planning to take its final step, and across the stars, new minds were building not to prevent the next Ultron, but to survive it. If stories like this make you wonder what else could have been, join us. The Marvel Universe has countless timelines, and we're just getting started.